To start this music video, I had to do a lot of planning. That began with some detailed storyboarding. The storyboards are just basic sketches, but it was enough to get the beats for the client to decide on. The wolf character was by far the most complicated. She needed hands for gesturing as well as paws for running. Even though I had pre-made Room Guardian wolf parts, I still sketched out the wolf design to show the client. I cast some basic wolf parts in resin, and the wolf head didn't have movable ears, so I had to Dremel off the ears, and then I ground into the head and added epoxy clay to fill in the holes so the ears could have a socket to bend in. Once that dried, I put a hole through it, and I sanded down my ears so they had a smooth, round bottom. Then I Dremel cut parts for added movement. I also used the Dremel to modify the legs. I had to cut out each foot at the ankle and then grind in holes in the paws and the ankles so I could add wire for wrist and ankle movement. I also had to grind down a lip on each edge for the fur to attach to. This took a long time. Then I used wire to sculpt a frame for the hands, and then I used cos clay on top of the hands to make sure they were bendable. I added them to a resin arm, and then I assembled an armature with jeton joints for the body. I started painting with a white base layer. I added subtle shadows with dry brush, and then I used a shimmery purple pigment for the accents to make it look a little bit more magical. I painted the paw pads and the claws. To cover up the wrist parts, I used some stretchy fur material, sewed it on, and then cut down the fur. I added pipe cleaners to the armature and then foam to the meatier parts of the body. Then I added quilter batting on top of the foam. Next, for the fur, I brushed silver yarn into small wefts. Then I cut off the knot at the top and melted the base of the strands. Then I sewed dozens of layers of fur, feathers, and fabric onto a backing for the fluffy part of the neck fur. I cut it and sewed it into a cylinder and attached it to the armature. I added fabric to the ear sockets and then started layering fur on the sides of the cheeks. I wanted a nice purpley undercoat, so it looked really magical. Then I added the back fur. I used a 4-way stretch off-white fur for the inside so the arms and legs would have optimum movement. I did the same for the back legs. You can see how fluffy the fur was before I cut it. And then I added the belly and the tail. This is all hand sewn, and I added pins in the elbows for the feet to change into hands, and I attached the ears with elastic. Here's the quadruped version and the version with hands. This wolf is easily the most complicated puppet I've ever made. It has every point of articulation it can possibly have, except for eye and jaw movement. And you can see the articulation in motion here. The puppet had to sit, run, and change from paws to hands. I am extremely proud of this almost seamless transition between paws and hands. The next puppet was a seal for the Selkie to turn into. I sculpted a little head out of clay and added beads for eyes. I sculpted little flippers out of clay as well. And I went shopping for shimmery silver fabrics, and I just used thrift store clothing to find what I wanted. I covered the armature with batting and yarn, and then I sewed my chosen sequined fabric on top of the armature. I painted on top of the sequins to make it look a little bit more natural, and it definitely looked better when animated than it did in person. Next task was designing the Selkie. I sketched a dozen iterations of the Selkie, but landed on this one. And because this puppet is going to be a silhouette paper puppet, I wanted to make sure the silhouette was very striking. Then I used my sketch of the Selkie to section off different points for movement on the paper puppet. I separated them onto a paper and I printed them out for a test. After the test, I modified the design a little and then spread all my pieces onto a paper to print out. The next puppet was the man. He's the villain character. So I did the same process with him, and he's a little bit more complicated because he has clothing, but I separated all the parts onto a paper and then I printed them out for a trial puppet. For the real puppets, I used watercolor paper and I colored it a deep purple and a deep red. The purple was for the Selkie and the red is for the man. I used a graphite transfer to get the designs on the back of the watercolor paper. And then I used my X-Acto knife to cut them out. Here's the final man puppet. You can see how articulated it is. It has a really satisfying movement. I used paper brads for all the joints. Shout out to Robert Crisp on TikTok for this method. Basically, I just use a hole punch, cut out 2 lines in the hole punch, and put a strip of paper through it. Then you just glue on the strip of paper, and you have an easy movable joint. You can see how it works here. The head is just attached to those little strips. And that's how much movement you get. I did the same for the Selkie. And she was even smaller, so a lot more delicate on the fingers and the feet. But she didn't have to move quite as much as the man either. All the edges of the puppets are colored black, so it hides all the white seams. I wasn't sure what I was going to do for the Selkie's hair, so I did a trial animation test with clay to see how I liked it. I really liked the way it animated, but I decided to animate the hair separate from the puppet and attach it digitally so it would be easier. And here's the final version of that. You can see how that's attached. It worked out pretty great. Next, I had to make a horse puppet. So I just took a horse sketch, did the same process on a paper, cut it out, and this is my horse silhouette. It's a pretty big puppet. The horse just had to move in slow-mo. The last puppet was a moth puppet. I based it on a mullein wave, which is apparently a moth that is sometimes by the ocean side, so I thought it would fit, and it was mainly white. I made a wire frame and then put a clay body on top of it. Then I painted some wings that shimmered on cardstock. I cut the front and the back out and then glued them over the wire armature. And I put some feathers on the antenna. Here's the final version. You can see how that animated, and I love the little shimmer of the wings. Wait for part 2 to see how I made the backgrounds and animated the puppets.